This is a very scary moment in our politics. Everything we care about, economic growth, abortion, immigration, free speech, rests on our collective ability to live with people who are different from us in fundamental ways. Different in how they view the world. Different in what they want out of life. Different in ways that people have traditionally killed each other over. Pretending these differences aren't there hasn't worked. Trying to force people to admit they agree with you also hasn't worked. The only thing that can work is open and honest debate and disagreement. My name is Jerusalem Demsas. I'm the founder and editor of The Argument, a magazine dedicated to bringing everyone from socialists to conservatives together to talk about the biggest issues of the day. The Argument is against subtweeting. We state our opinions openly and we engage with our opponents directly. The first episode of this podcast was a live event in early September with a few of my favorite opinion journalists. Thompson, who is formerly of The Atlantic and now writing a newsletter at Substack, Ezra Klein, who is at the New York Times Opinion, and Matt Yglesias, who is also writing a newsletter at Substack called Slow Boring. We talk about persuasion, the media, abundance, and what went wrong in liberalism. For an ad-free version of this episode, you can become a subscriber at theargumentmag.com. All right, so this is the inaugural episode of the Arguments podcast.
Hey!
So, there's a lot of things that I think this four group of people should argue about, and that is essentially what I'm going to force them to do on stage in front of all of you. But I wanted to start with sort of why the argument exists. And a big reason that it exists is that I think that there's actually a lot of potential for persuasion. I think it's really possible to change people's minds, change what types of arguments and beliefs are most salient in the public space, if you are willing to get attention by being a little bombastic. And that's kind of what's really defined what we've tried to do at The Argument in our first long 2 weeks of existence. So I wanted to start, though, by getting you guys to talk a little bit about why you guys do what you do. Because I think all of us sort of feel that this is an extremely important moment in American political history, maybe even world political history. And I think that all of us feel that everyone should be doing what they can to prevent, authoritarian takeover and the rise of the post-liberal right. And I believe that a big part of what I can do here is try to create the conditions for an actual opposition to be palatable and attractive to voters and the American people. But all four of us, I think, have maybe different theories of how persuasion works. I think a lot of people in the public don't really think persuasion is possible. So, Ezra, I'll start with you. Why are you an opinion journalist at the New York Times? How does that actually help anyone?
It's a great question. I feel like there are three questions. Why do I do what I do? Because I love what I do. I mean, like Matt, and in some ways inspired by Matt, I got into this as a blogger, never having an intention of doing this professionally, knowing no professional journalists, never thinking of journalism as a career, having been rejected from my student newspaper in college.
Well, you actually rejected me at Vox in 2017. So.
I wasn't running hiring. It's probably Matt. But there's an answer about journalism, which is just, if you get to do it, it's an amazing profession where you get to call people up and ask them questions you are genuinely curious about, and they will give you their time. I just remember as a 21-year-old at the American Prospect, just being shocked that I could just call these world-famous experts up and they would just sit there and walk me through something for an hour. So that's a question about why I love what I do. You're asking also a different one about what the hell are we doing right now? And right now is not why I like doing what I do. I'd sort of prefer to take a nap and wake up when this one is over. But I guess what I'd say is that all of us, have our roles to play in this. And I think we are in an extraordinarily dangerous moment. It is cliche to say, but it is true. I mean, we are at the masked men roaming the streets stage of this already, right? We are at the fighting over how often you can disappear people to unknown prisons in the country of your choice point of this already, right? When the disappearance machine starts running, it doesn't like to stop. And as you're saying, the Democratic Party is a mess. And I remember when I was starting out, again, to just keep moving back and forth in time here, I remember I was like a young writing fellow at the American Prospect and talking to members of Congress, and I think in some way I thought they all had access to some information network where they all knew what was actually going on. And I would call them, and I was 22, and they'd be like, well, what have you heard? I'm like, what have I heard? I'm calling you. And like really quickly, I began to realize they didn't know. They were reading roll call and looking for hints in the Washington Post. There wasn't some centralized information source that the people in power like picked up the phone and got the real scoop. They were working off of very little. And just right now, with the Democratic Party in the state it's in, like I would say this in the most serious possible way, and without ego for any of us here or any of you, like no one is coming to save us. They don't have a plan. There's not some master strategy. I've asked if somebody over there knows what's going on. The answer was no. And so we're going to have to, like all of us and people far outside of this room, like people out there doing the No Kings protest, people in think tanks, people like everywhere at every level, like we are going to have to build something that can contest this and win. And if we don't, like this is not like losing to Mitt Romney in 2012. It's not like losing to, a fictitious Paul Ryan presidency. Like we are outside of that set of boundaries now. And I find the moment like very, very, very scary, and like all you can do is your best. So like I'm a journalist. I enjoy being a journalist. I have no other skills. And so like I will do my best. Like that's what I can do.
And so when you're thinking about, whether it's your podcast or your columns, like what to write, how to write, what guests to have, what to bring on. I mean, there's so many decisions that go into that if you're thinking about your role in the public space and the public sphere of trying to shape the debate and trying to shape the political frontier of what's possible. And so how do you think about like who to bring on and why? Because, you could just every single week have another podcast about how someone has been abducted or how we have decided apparently it's okay to drone strike people in the middle of the ocean without checking to see first if they're actually, actually no one actually deserves to get drone struck in the middle of the ocean, but we could obviously interdict them, and we can make sure that that's actually something we should be doing before, and also maybe get an act of Congress first to make sure that that's fully legal. And so my question to you is sort of, how do you think about what sorts of ideas, issues should actually be platformed by you, and what conversations are actually worth having?
That's a hard question, because I'm not the New York Times. I'm one person. I have a great team, but at best I can release 2 podcasts a week and a couple columns a month, right? That's what I can do. And so it's like a complicated set of decisions made mostly by intuition, which I've come to trust over the years. And I try to do things that I think I can specifically do well. There are issues I think are important, but I'm not the person who either has the knowledge of them, the commitment to them. I can't find the guest for them. I can't get there fast enough. Somebody else has done it brilliantly already. There are things that I just can't stop thinking about, right? Israel and Gaza is one of them, right? I just have a lot of personal investment there and heartbreak. And, there are things where I think I am seeing something that has like life in it, which was like true for the early supply side liberalism and what became abundance columns and work. There's things that I think we just have to be there on. And there, at this point in my career, I do understand like part of my role is being in conversation with through the Times and through the podcast, sort of like liberalism or the liberal side of the Democratic Party or something. And so I'm particularly interested in, I'm oftentimes trying to bring the internal argument of the Democratic Party, or the at least argument I think is there or should be there, out into the light where it can be had with more rigor, or at least had in a way I think is more rigorous. because the point is not that the podcast or the column, for that matter, for me, is ever meant to be the last word on anything, but it's meant to be a generative discussion about something that then other people can take and have other discussions, and which leads to some result that I can't predict, but is hopefully positive.
It's funny. I think that exactly what you said is one of the most surprising things that I've discovered in being a writer. You sort of think at the beginning when you start being a journalist that there's going to be some equation that tells you what things you should cover and when. And I mean, and even just in starting the argument and starting a company, you think that it's a very, very, I thought about it, I didn't just do it, but you think it's going to be a very, very considered decision where, you weigh the factors, then it becomes obvious what you should do, and how much of things just ends up being intuition is shocking.
Great editors are intuitive, and something that'll take you, hopefully you can speed run it faster than I did, but great editors learn to trust their intuition. And the problem for journalism, for that matter, liberalism, for a while, is that the simplest way to bypass that process is you can cover what everybody else is covering. And then social media made it so easy to know what everybody else is covering. And so having access to all this information made all the journalism more the same. And the great editors and the great places still have a voice, like New York Magazine, are places where the editor trusts themselves. The reason Substack exploded, I'm on the stage with 3 Substackers, is every Substack you can feel the imprint of somebody's taste on it. And people are desperate for the imprint of a live mind on things. We need the New York Times, but we also need things that are not the New York Times. And everything became an imitation of something else because, we sort of stopped trusting intuition. We had too much access to traffic analytics, and we could see what was popping on social media, and it was hell on having actual editorial judgment anymore.
Speaking of things that are not the New York Times, Matt, why do you do what you do?
What do I do? I do different things for different reasons. I'm older than the other 3 of you. And, I feel like in some ways, as I have crossed what I think will probably be the middle point of my career.
Don't speak that into existence.
No, but really, a lot of what I am focused on trying to do is create an environment that is going to be more supportive for other people and make it known. Because I want people to know that if they want to pick fights and be out there and take shit from people, that at least one other person will have their backs, that I am eager to be in the mix and in the dirt and throwing punches and in the shit. There's the old joke is that a liberal is someone who's too high-minded to take their own side in an argument. And I often feel actually that we have that on the center left, at least with regard to people who are on the further left, that even you start the thing out and you're Trump is bad, and you had 4 different ways of situating that, which is true, I agree. He is bad. But then, I read other stuff. There's this review, very mean-spirited review of Ezra Derrick's book in the New York Review of Books. And I'm reading it and I'm I don't really get this. What's going on here? And I kind of scroll to the end and I see the author's bio. And he is just the author of 7 books about why we need to end capitalism. And so it's true, Abundance isn't a book about how we should be communists. And the whole review could have just been as a communist.
Karl Marx, though.
It does. No, but that's where I was going, which is is the impulse that we need to be we can be cool communists too, right? And I don't know. I want to get people to people who I think are like-minded with me to stand up for themselves and to show that that is possible, that it is just okay to say this is in fact not the maximally left position because I don't think the maximally left position is correct, and to say that squarely and to look into the eye of the beast and just be no, we disagree, that's all right, because I think that I like it, and not everybody likes it, and not everybody has to be the same, but it's it's helpful, if I can be the hero that Gotham needs at times. And let somebody else be nice. I see Ted Nordhaus in the audience, and I often hear this from other people about Ted. They'll be can't he just be a little bit more chill? And I'd be no, you can be chill because Ted is so aggro. And
Wait, can I ask you a question? So it's often, people often note that a lot of people on the left, they seem they definitely act like their real enemies are liberals. Like the people like they're really in a fight with are not the Trump administration or the right, but specifically Derek. And would you now say like the way you like I was interested by that answer. Would you say that like the way you perceive what you're doing, like the real debate you're in now is with the left?
I would say the distinctive debate that I'm in is with the left. You know, like I did a piece about tariffs and like how they're bad, you know, so like that's good. And I got one come in on Monday about Eric Schmidt's piece at NatCon and how it's like a betrayal of the American tradition and da-da-da. So like, I mean, I believe that. I think that's important.
Much faster than me.
I think a lot of people are doing those takes, doing them very well, often doing them at the New York Times. You know, and it's like, you know, but I mean, not you, but like Michelle and Jamel, are there just like brilliant articulators of like the progressive take on why Donald Trump is bad. I can also do those takes. I don't know that I can do them better than those two can or all that differently or that changes anybody's mind in like a meaningful way.
Like whose mind are you trying to change?
I mean, I'm trying to change the minds mostly of like highly bought in, highly engaged people who care a lot about politics, who think that Donald Trump and MAGA like is bad. But the question is like, what do we do about that? And some of what I do on the Substack is things that I think would not be considered journalistic at all. Like I tell people like which state legislative races are particularly strategic and you should donate money to. Sometimes it gets felt as like just trolling or like infighting and stuff like that. But like, I try to be very supportive. I mean, Slow Boring Readers donated hundreds of thousands of dollars 2024 campaign to down ballot races, won a North Carolina state Supreme Court race by like a couple hundred votes that we sent tens of thousands of dollars to. That's things that you can do as sort of an independent person. But this is all part of like the same project of trying to do a fairly intra-elite persuasion about like how do we respond tactically in this kind of situation. Some of that is about things like which races are really strategic, who really needs our money, but some of it is about like which ideas work, which platform should we be on, which fights should we be picking with the right, rather than what is most emotive, what's most expressive to us, like what do we feel, what do we sort of get maximally retweeted on.
But I think in some ways it's actually like intentional with what Ezra's saying about kind of following his intuition. And you are kind of talking about, in particular, I mean, it sounds like your intuition just to maybe troll people sometimes, but I think also what you're talking about here is that, you know, you think that the most important thing is to sort of fight with the left over what the alternative to Trumpism should be. Is that right?
I mean, it's not the most important thing, I think, like objectively. I think it's the most important thing for me to do now, right? I mean, like different people can do different things. We don't all need to be all things to all people. You know, and I even like, I write a column once a week for Bloomberg. And I try to think there, like, what would be relevant to the Bloomberg audience. That's a much more conservative audience than I've had at any other outlet that I've ever written to. And I do actually way more, like, Trump is bad takes in that forum, because I'm trying to talk to these finance bros, you know, and I'm trying to change their minds. And I did a piece for The Argument, and my editor from Bloomberg said to me what I thought was, like, a great compliment about that piece, which was he liked it. He didn't think it would have been a good Bloomberg piece. You know, but that's like, because I'm a professional. So I'm like, I'm trying to write something for The Argument that makes sense there. For Bloomberg, I write something else that makes sense there. You know, if I had Ezra's job, which I think is like a weightier burden than the job that I carry, you know, because it's like, it's all the news that's fit to print. And you like really do need to speak to the history books, I think, in that role to some extent. And like, choose your battles strategically, because it's also a limited bandwidth of output, right? But like each thing is supposed to be like really impactful. So it can't just be, I have a grudge with Jeff Hauser, right? Like that, that would not be a good use of that real estate, even though it would make me happy to see that piece come out. But so, you know, it's like, it's my Substack, so I persecute my enemies.
So I think that in some ways, you know, Matt, you've articulated sort of a theory of when to pick fights. And I think, Derek, you've lived this very recently about when to pick fights and why. So I'm hoping, A, can you explain what fight you most recently picked and why you thought it was valuable?
Sure. I also really wanted to answer the earlier question about like why I got into this.
Sure,
This is my being extremely agreeable.
What happened?
And not wanting to dip immediately into my tete-a-tetes against other people on the internet.
So I want to argue with what you think Derek's most recent fight is, because I think what you have in your head is not his most recent fight.
I don't even know my most recent fight. It's been a month of fighting. It's been a season of fighting.
A lot of people wrong about obesity.
That's
like
right.
calories in, calories out.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. I've been
Just
fighting.
because it's not big on Twitter doesn't mean people aren't wrong about it.
That's true. Very true. I will say that one thing that I love about my job, and Ezra absolutely touched on this, is that as my wife in the second row would definitely attest to, I do think I have like a mild form of ADHD. And one thing that journalism, especially sort of general assignment journalism, allows one to do is to psychologically sublimate their ADHD and turn it into a profession. Like, I love being able to read the news and just look at Twitter or read the New York Times or read Matt's column or the argument and think, oh my God, obesity, ultra-processed foods, how do those even work? What does that even mean? What does it mean to be ultra-processed? Oh, they found an exoplanet with aliens that's 12 light years or 120 light years away. How do you find aliens in a place that you don't have cameras? What would that even look like? And then I read about tariffs and I want to understand, wait, what was Smoot-Hawley? And how did
Also, a
it happen?
huge news break right there.
They thought they found
We went by really quick.
They thought they were wrong.
ultra-processed
They thought that they found a biosignature that indicated the probability of aliens that was later reanalyzed. The biosignature was wrongly analyzed.
It's actually a hot pocket.
It was a hot pocket. Yeah, exactly. Someone's steaming in front of the spectroscopy device.
The truth is out there, but it's buried in an argument podcast.
So I love being able to like surf the news and offer frames. And that connects actually really deeply to like my theory of persuasion, which is that persuasion doesn't exist. No one is actually persuaded or of anything to the extent that they truly change their mind. And there's
Really?
a theory, yeah, so there's this idea called moral foundations theory that says that fundamentally if what you want to do is change someone's mind about politics, you don't tell them that they're wrong. You tell them that the degree to which they're right, that their correct opinions might lead inexorably to your political beliefs. Mm-hmm. So for example, let's say that the original study that was done on moral foundations, I think was done with gay marriage. And the idea was if you're talking to a conservative in the early 2000s about gay marriage, you don't make an argument about the degree to which they're wrong about marriage purity, meaning that marriage only exists between a man and a woman. What you unlock instead is the value that they share in family stability. And you say that given the existence of gay people in this world, don't you want them to raise children in a stable environment? And maybe by talking about an issue on which you disagree, in the values and with the language and vocabulary that they feel most comfortable in, they'll feel more comfortable not changing their mind, because that's an enormous threat to identity, but rather saying, oh, I can see how the way that I've always thought might lead somewhat to another opinion. And I found personally that that's much more likely to not only change my mind, to allow me to sort of hold on to my identity, but also change the specific ideas that my identity sort of like grabs onto in the political sphere. But also I found it's very successful for changing other people's minds. And what that means is that fundamentally, my job as a journalist, so that I see persuasion and journalism, is fundamentally about framing. Like, how do I find the most compelling and most memorable frame that can pull the most people into the story? And so I think when I do my job well, like for something like Abundance Agenda, what I'm able to offer is a frame that's capacious enough and just sticky enough that a lot of people can see themselves in it. It's like it holds up a mirror to many different audiences, and they see things in that mirror that I didn't even necessarily intend. And so, someone from the left maybe sees the way in which abundance can lead to a green energy future. And someone from the right sees the fact that libertarianism is reflected in the abundance agenda. And someone who's YIMBY sees the fact that housing abundance is reflected in it. And so I very much see my job as a job of finding frames for different stories that can persuade people because they see themselves reflected in it. Now, you asked about who I'm fighting.
Yeah, now I'm very curious about your decision to.
So I told you when I started my Substack, I said there's 2 articles that I really want to write that I've already written half of. The first article is that I think that liberals and the left don't get along online. But when I talk to progressive politicians, what they tell me is that there's all sorts of ideas in abundance that they think are fantastic. I had a conversation with Zoran Mamdani where I think I said essentially to him, I said this on the stage with Ezra earlier today, if you want to add government functions to the mayorship of New York City, you'd better damn well make sure that government functions in the first place. So state capacity is incredibly important for proving the success of democratic socialism, don't you think? And he was enthusiastic about that. I found in talking to congressmen and left-wing mayors and people in Congress and off-the-record conversations that they're much more likely to agree with abundance when you talk to politicians than when you see the arguments of abundance reflected online. And so I told you, there's one piece that I want to write that's about what I call the poster-politician divide. That like online, the left-wing posters are very anti-abundance. But when you talk to progressive politicians, they often see something reflected in the idea of abundance that they can latch onto. At the same time, I said, there's this argument in the world of housing that the biggest problem with housing in America is that housing is an oligopoly. And in particular, there's this argument, there's this long, long essay about how Dallas, which builds more houses than any metro in the country, is a dangerous home-building oligopoly, and it's created a housing shortage in Dallas. And I look at this article and I say, housing shortage in Dallas, there's a higher inventory of houses now than there's ever been in the last 15 years. Housing oligopoly, the biggest home builder in Dallas controls like 15% of the market. Like if 15% of a market is dangerous monopoly, then we need to break up every single market in America. And furthermore, there were all sorts of little claims when I called up individuals in this essay that they would essentially say, I feel like my work is being either slightly misrepresented or I feel like the way in which my work is being used doesn't adequately represent the thesis of this article, which says that Dallas is a dangerous home-building oligopoly, a cartel. So I told you, I said, I feel a little bit torn because on the one hand, I kind of want to write this article that liberals and the left should get along a little bit more than they will. And at the same time, I really want to drop this grenade that essentially says that this argument.
And you did both.
And I did both. I had an olive branch in my left hand and I had the grenade in my right hand. And I understand that that created a little bit of brand confusion. But look, the reason that I wrote the second piece, even though I'm pathologically agreeable and don't like online fights nearly as much as maybe I should, is that I really do think that in addition to building coalitions on the left, it's also important to just say the damn truth, right? Like housing is an incredibly important issue in this country. It's a problem, and correctly diagnosing the problem of housing shortages in productive cities is really important. If the patient walks into the office and their leg is falling off, and you diagnose them with arrhythmia, well, that's not helpful at all for the leg that's falling off. So I really wanted to be clear that if we want to solve the problem of housing scarcity in America's most productive cities, we need to look that problem in the face and accurately diagnose it. And just waving the banner of anti-monopoly wherever we see any kind of problem bubbling up, I don't think that's necessarily the most helpful way to go about being a policy activist or a policy journalist. So that's why I did at the beginning of my launch in the Substack both say there's a poster-politician divide and I wish we got along a little bit more, and then say, and also this article is completely full of...
And this is interesting because this was not a piece that was in the New York Times. This was not a piece, that you were responding to. It's not a piece that was, had gone viral and was now shaping the housing debate in Dallas and the entire country. This was a situation where, someone made you mad online. There was someone who was saying, I think that Derek is wrong about his view of housing, of his view of the economy, of his view of the world. They're not that big of a deal. I guess now I'm insulting this person, but and why respond to them?
It's a question that I ask myself a lot in the writing of the piece.
Yeah,
wait, I don't think that's right. Because what happens is, right, so the basic YIMBY narrative has gained a ton of traction over the past 10, 15 years, right? It's part of the book Abundance, but it's bigger and bigger than that. And you have a lot of specific arguments in specific cities, specific states, which normally focus on literal NIMBYism, where somebody might be sure, great book, but I just don't want more kids at my local school, right? This counter-narrative was not super prominent, but it was the most prominent theoretical critique of the diagnosis, as opposed to just somebody being but I like local control, or I'm a councilman and I don't want to give up my discretionary privilege. This was a reason that the view was wrong. And because we know there was all this diffuse, free-floating, I don't want it next to my house kind of sentiment out there, like a big argument that would actually defend that position, it's like a very powerful tool. And I think it's like important to see around the corner. And
That's what you were thinking, Derek?
Well, I
it's the most prominent argument that was out there.
I think that's a totally valid summary of what I was thinking. On the one hand, look, on the one hand, yes, this was an article that was published in the New York Times. It wasn't like the cover story of like the New Yorker. But at the same time, it was a really prominent article that got a lot of readership, that was sent to me by many different people, including my editor at The Atlantic, presenting what many of them considered a really valid counter theory as to why is it so hard to build housing in America, right? One thing that we were saying was it has a lot to do with rules. It has a lot to do with zoning, and it has a lot to do with permitting. And of course, I think it also has a lot to do with business cycles. And there's some places that don't have enough workers, and there's some places that don't have enough other inputs. But here was a theory that essentially said, no, it's because home builders are too big. And what's important about that argument, or really struck me as interesting, we had a citation of an Ed Glazer piece in our book that made the exact opposite argument. In fact, one of the reasons why the construction industry is one of the only industries in America that has seen practically no productivity growth in the last 50 years. One of the big reasons why is that almost all of the industries that have managed to see productivity growth have been able to scale. But because there are so many local rules for housing construction, it's very difficult for any home builder to scale enough that they can actually learn by doing and drive costs down by becoming smarter and more efficient at building homes. So one thing we were saying is local rules get in the way of allowing home builders to get big enough that we Americans can have housing abundance. And this article said, no, we need to make home builders much, much smaller, even in the city that's building more houses than any other city in America. And yeah, the truth is, at an emotional level, I found that to be incredibly implausible. But I also thought it was like, I do think it's important that we've written a book, and the book has become its own sort of, self-perpetuating discourse machine, to engage really honestly with the discourse, to engage really honestly with the critics who have the longest and most prominent critiques of our work. Otherwise, we're not doing our job. We're ducking some of the most popular critiques. So I felt that even though it really went against a lot of my sort of my personality and what I typically do as a writer, I thought it was really, really important to say, here's a piece that I think has gotten a lot of play. And it's gotten a lot of attention, has received a lot of respect, and I really do think that it's built on a shell of misunderstandings.
It's funny. I think actually there's like some tension between the theory of persuasion that you laid out for us around just trying to reframe ideas in the way that people will already accept them as inexorably flowing from their other commitments. Mm-hmm. And this other thing which you're saying, which I really resonate with, because is that a lot of times like people will come across arguments that they haven't really thought about that much. So, maybe they've been like, housing is something I care about a lot. I think it's really important that, we make housing cheaper and more accessible in this country. But, you haven't really, really thought through, what is every link in the argument for, why housing is expensive and what you would need to do to stop it. You hear a lot of different things, and you don't really, put together a perfect model of, what's going on there. And so when you see an argument that says, actually the reason is, there's a monopolistic or oligopolistic problem going on, you are kind of pushed, and you don't see a response, but you are pushed in that direction just by virtue of it feeling sort of complete. And so I think that's interesting. But I want to turn, Ezra, to you, because you said something interesting in your conversation that you and Derek had with David Brooks at the Abundance Conference earlier today, which is that you are really trying not to be pushed into fights. You want to pick the fights you want to pick, and that's a very strategic way of thinking about how to get into fights with people. And I think that when you are writing Abundance with Derek, did you expect the backlash that you guys got from the anti-monopoly folks?
Well, let me say, I said something slightly different in that conversation, which is, and I was saying this to that room of people, that I think yes, it is true that I choose which fights I'm going to engage with. I think that's, even Matt, despite his rhetoric, is making choices.
Reality.
They may be more or less strategic, but they're choices. I said there, and I believe this, that you got to be very careful not to let other people decide if you're their enemy. And there are reasons a bunch of terminally online, like neo-Brandeisians, want to make us the other side of an attentional battle. Abundance got a lot of attention, and it's been like good for retweets and other things to like try to like create a lot of energy. Like X in some of these other platforms are built on unleashing the energy of conflict. And that's fine. And I've actually learned a lot from these fights, and like we can talk about what that is. But it's very, I think, important to like maintain your own both like emotional and intellectual space such that you don't let somebody else polarize you against them. I have my actual arguments with some of these people, and they're different. Like Matt Stoller is different from Zephyr Teachout, is different than other folks. But I don't want to like give my autonomy over to other people. Like the fact that they've decided to like spend their days like lobbing whatever we call X's now at me, I don't want to lose the ability to hear the parts of their arguments I might want to know.
I recently wrote a piece about the case for staying on Twitter and still having arguments in a space that's like now quite overrun with Nazis and other unsavory people. But I think the best counter argument to staying on Twitter is exactly what you're kind of laying out here, which is that you can get so easily negatively polarized against people and things you already believe.
I've always said about Twitter, and I don't begrudge anybody who's there. I don't think your case didn't make sense. Look, I think like a lot of people are very.
It's called the argument. You can say it
but I think this like all needs an ecosystem. You don't want everybody to have my attitude of like being a conscientious objector to the nature of Twitter. Like I think like say like Matt's sort of combat about moderation there is valuable. Like I think it is doing something. I think it like again like to me he is more strategic like and like really picking fights. Oftentimes like need to be picked, and other people don't want to because we're agreeable and it makes us stressed out and it makes us anxious. But I've always said the reason I do not spend much time there is because I feel that it makes me worse. Like I get angry. I stop being able to listen to the people who I have like come into contact there. My joke about this, but it's not really a joke, is that podcasts make me like people I dislike, and Twitter makes me hate people I like. And I mean that sort of also for myself. I don't love the version of me that you get once I've been on there for a couple months again, and I'm tired because my kids woke me up a bunch of times during the night, and then I see a tweet I don't like. And I think, we're talking about arguments and disagreeability here. I think it's important to argue. I think it's important to also recognize there are things you cannot learn without argumentation. I have learned a lot just even from like the abundance arguments, the ones I expected, but also the ones I didn't expect. And I know that's what your question actually was. But argument can be constructive and it can be destructive. And I think for me, one of the questions is how to be in argument with people, oftentimes like quite serious argument, in a way that does not break my sense of being in community with them. And like we're sitting on here as if like, this is sort of like the question I was asking earlier, but we're sitting up here like, I don't find it hard to be in community with like left populists. There's a huge amount of that I have sympathy for, and then places where I don't think it adds up, and like that's fine with me. I have Trump voters in my family. I have sources in the administration. I find it much harder to be in political community with people who either want to rev up a denaturalization machine or who are just okay with that happening. And yet, like, we're still going to be in this country with them. And so what does it mean? I mean, I got a piece coming out in a couple of days. It's like pretty fucking serious about raising the alarm on what we are going through. What does it mean to like balance that and also the idea that any kind of de-escalation from here, any kind of victories from here, political victories, maintain like being in country together? Like you and I have been talking a lot about what liberalism means. And I think like one of the big projects that I've been embarking on like over this year is like going back into the canon and like trying to think about how to redescribe it and what was valuable in there and what got lost. And like, I'd love to talk about that. But I guess one thing that I would say that I think is really interesting as I've been going through a lot of old books is a lot of the really, I think, great American liberals were people who knew they had to be in community with people who had either done them terrible harm or could at any moment or wanted to, right? And so, like, you know, Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King Jr., but like a lot of American liberalism is built by Jews, many of them who fled other places, right? And understood they would be a minority here and in community with people who could be anti-Semitic, could be, you know, like at any moment turn on them. And there is something I find really remarkable and inspiring about, you know, Barack Obama in a different way, like recognizing like he was gonna have to win the votes of people who were fundamentally racist. And he understood that perfectly well. And I find something genuinely inspiring about this question of like, how are you in disagreement? How are you steadfast in your political beliefs with people who believe something that you believe at times to be fundamentally immoral? And at the same time, you recognize that like somehow the outcome of that disagreement has to maintain some level of community between you. My biggest problem with Twitter is that it is acid on community. Like, it is acid on the bonds between people. The reason not to be there, in my view, is not just that Elon Musk will turn it into a megaphone for whatever his cause is at the moment he wants to, right? Although I do think that's a problem. But that it's very, like, I just find it over time they're harder to maintain bonds with, like, people I disagree with. And, like, that's not what I want. I want to be able to disagree with people while maintaining my bond with them. Other people are better at this than me. It's like, I don't deny that it might be a personality defect. But that, like, I think it's not just a Twitter question, it's a very profound, like, political question at this moment. I keep thinking back recently, because I'm thinking about Obama as part of all this, remembering that, like, his first big speech is about the question of your first newsletter, right? How do we live in community together? What kind of God do we worship in the blue states, and we don't like people in our libraries, poking around our libraries in the red states? Like, his first big speech is about what does it mean to still be in this country, and maybe to recognize that some of how it feels in politics isn't the only way it can feel. It is not the whole truth of it. So yeah, I had views about who would backlash the book, but they're not.
So I mean, like, you got us on the subject
that
of liberalism, and yeah, I mean, the first article I wrote for the argument is about how do we live with each other, and you know, I mean, this is the central question that liberalism tries to answer, and this is what the argument is trying to do is figuring out, you know, in the course of the biggest issues that we're facing in this country that people care about, whether it's the cost of living or it's immigration or it's how we define, you know, what is a woman, that these questions about identity and community and these political questions, how do they answer them in a way that's actually compelling to the public? And I think, you know, there's like two parts of this, and I want to get into some of these particular issues, but I think first it's sort of like this larger question of what went wrong within liberalism that it lost this focus on living in community with people who you have deep disagreements with? Because I think that, you know, I think there's two sort of answers floating around there that I would love your folks' reactions to. Well, your guys' reactions, not your parents' reactions.
I have interesting things to say, to be honest.
Yeah. Your guys' reactions to. One is, I think that, you know, the fundamental questions that people started asking about in politics became so personal. Like, Trump was not, in 2016, was not just, you know, talking about marginal tax rates, which are important and have an impact on inequality, but he was saying, you know, certain kinds of people should not get to live in this country. You don't get to be an American if you are from one of these shithole countries, or if you are from one of these places of the world that, you know, I guess the euphemism is they're not white countries, or you haven't been here long enough, and now it's getting even more explicit. You guys referenced the speech that Schmidt gave at the National Conservatism Conference about, you know, what it actually means to be an American. And like, there's a sense, I think, on a lot of people on the left that are like, hey, like, we didn't change. what changed is all of a sudden the debate became about these fundamental things that, of course, you can't be in community with these people. Like, how could you be in community with someone who says, if you are a woman, it means you shouldn't get these sorts of educational or employment opportunities. If you're a person of color, you don't have the same access to citizenship or being seen as an American. If you are, a gender minority or you're transgender, you shouldn't have access to certain kinds of health care, or you should be like hounded out of the bathroom and made to see if you are actually a woman or a man or whatever it is. And like, these questions are so personal that you can't actually live in community. We just ran a poll at the argument recently about this, and you see that liberals are much more likely to say that it's reasonable to cut off your family and reasonable to cut off your friends as a result of political disagreement than conservatives are. And Laksha Jain, who's running that polling program for us, he wrote an article about this, and a lot of people had that reaction. We're like, of course liberals feel that way. Look what you're doing to us. And then, the second kind of macro argument made about why liberalism has failed to maintain this ethos of living with people who you are in disagreement with, the second version of this is that, actually liberals themselves became more intolerant. That, like, progressivism, that wokeism, that all of these things made it such that, progressives no longer wanted to adhere to liberal values, small L liberal values, around living in community with people who are different than you. And so these are two, I think, there's ways in which they can both be true, but I'm curious your reactions, and Matt keeps smiling, so I'm sure you're the first person who you're going to answer this for me.
Two things can be true. I think the left shot first in this, frankly, and that there was a real abandonment of liberal principles in left-of-center institutions, that people started raising fundamentally illiberal arguments, procedurally, total abandonment of epistemic rigor, of any kind of principles.
Well, give examples. How has that happened?
Around questions of identity. I think starting quite a ways back, I forget the name of the guy, but there was somebody in California who had donated to the bad side of a gay marriage ballot initiative. And there was this idea that he needed to be shunned, right? Because he was on the wrong side of a political disagreement. That wasn't just a political disagreement. It spoke to the fundamental humanity of people. And lots of people, myself included, honestly, just went along with that. It was we're on the right side of history, the moral arc of the universe is bending, and we're just gonna do it. And I think there was more and more impulse for that to call for these sort of second degree shunnings, right? And it reached a really high-profile and politically costly apogee when Bernie Sanders went on the Joe Rogan show, and Joe Rogan was like, "I like you, Bernie Sanders." And then people, they're running in a primary against each other, right? It's politics. You try to take down your enemies. And what was leveraged against Bernie was the idea that it was improper to have sought political support from a guy who had the transphobic view that trans women should not be in combat sports against cisgender women. That was the specific sin. And very mainstream Democrats, in part because they believed it, in part because they themselves didn't want to be bullied, and in part because they just wanted to beat Bernie Sanders in an election, were that's a great argument, guys. This makes a ton of sense. And Ezra, who as we know is strategic, chose to come down from the mountaintop and weigh in on that one. And the reaction to
on Bernie Sanders' side.
Yeah, on Bernie's side. And the reaction to, I think, an obviously correct argument for Ezra's was still people weren't wow, even Mr. Reasonable is telling us to chill out. And it was you could tell things were really reaching a fever around then. And that was right before COVID, which then put everyone online all the time, where we are not our best selves, I think, in a lot of ways in the discourse. And George Floyd died, and it was a real crescendo. But I point to the Rogan thing because that was before COVID, right?
Yeah.
But it showed and because it was Bernie was the victim, right? It was the centrist faction of the Democratic Party was really getting in on this stuff. And
I want to push here because, I just spent the week, and if anyone saw this, I'm not just carrying around a National Conservatism book for fun. But this is the program that they had, and I was at the National Conservatives Conference this week, and it's interesting, it was the same week as the Abundance Conference, which is, I don't know if anyone planned that or if that was just on accident. But this idea that progressives started it is just like rampant. Like there are like two things that tied together this conference across all of these different panels, all of these different conversations that I was having, all the people I was talking to in the hallways. One was immigration, which we'll get to that. The second one was just like that, like progressives started it. They started this woke thing, and now we have to bring the war back because they tried to eradicate us. Because they tried to eradicate the people who have these views on gender, these views on sexuality, whatever it is. We need to fight back. And I think that there's like something here about like very, very different things are trying to be done on the left versus right. Like, I think that it's true that, like, embodying the sense of, okay, let's have, like, people can have reasonable disagreement about issues and we should talk about them. Like, I do not think that people on the left, including myself, fully embodied that throughout the, I think you called it the Great Awakening, is your coinage here. I don't think we fully embodied it, but I think that's very, very different than using an arm of the state to impose your view of what the good life is supposed to be like. So, yes, people did use a lot of shunning. They used the private power that they had to say, like, don't hire this person. We're going to tweet about how we hate them. And the argument is usually like, isn't that just like free speech? Isn't that people using the marketplace of ideas to push back on things they disagree with? And like, I'm not even sure if it's the same. It's like, oh, progressives like sent a paperclip at you and then you shot them with a bazooka. Like, is that like really the same thing?
Well, I mean, I don't think that the parsing of the timeline is like the critical thing here. What I will say on behalf of the NatCon project is that it is an explicitly illiberal project, right? So nobody's like, why did the National Conservatives become illiberal? It's like, because it's a self-consciously illiberal project.
Although
right?
I will say, I had Yoram Hazony on my show, and he like had the same sort of account here, which I found like a little bit shocking. Because I'm like, yeah, you have an explicitly liberal project. He's like, we only had to do this because you guys got very woke.
No, and that's, but I mean, but that I think is a little crazy, right? Like, look what you made me do, right? Like that's childish. That's like, 5-year-old logic. And I think actually not reflective of Hazony's actual
Yes, I agree with
intellectual
that.
introversion, right?
Not.
So like, different countries have different traditions.
Yes.
Conservatives conserve traditions. The American tradition is a liberal, like broad church, liberal tradition. Thomas Jefferson, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They like imported an Israeli, like Zionism is an illiberal nationalist project that he is part of, European conservatism, right? And so like even the phrase national conservatism is in contradistinction to the EU project. Right? It doesn't like mean anything in the American context. And so these people, they're grabbing onto shit, blah, 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 blah. But I mean, I think that like as liberals, as people who want to say that we are liberals, we need to ask the question of like, are we being liberal? The fact that the self-consciously illiberal people are not liberal is an important fact about it.
I want to weigh in on Matt's side of this a bit. And I think the Prop 8, which was the California ballot initiative, if I'm not misremembering, is like a very good example here. And I'm not fully saying like who shot first. I think that like you can kind of run this stuff forever. But we definitely shot. And I've spent a lot of time over the past year thinking about this sort of period of time. And a particular sin Matt identified, I think was behind, and a sin I have been guilty of, to be super clear, was behind a lot of, like, I think cost us a lot, which was a thing we might think is bad is happening to a person we think is bad. So who cares? One of the current stories going on, which I think like would not be happening here, but I think is interesting, is this comedian in the UK. It just like seems like a shitty guy who like sent out a bunch of like very transphobic, shitty tweets. Just like, forget even the word, like just being a jerk. But he's met by cops in Heathrow. And like, that's a very illiberal thing happening. And I think, and it's got like kind of become like a big free press thing. And I was reading a piece about it in Compact. And I was like, they're right. And like, we should say they are right. And I think for a long time didn't. And I like look back on like that sort of like the fever pitch of the 2020s and like there's a lot going on, there's COVID happening, but there's also this like explosion of online algorithmic speech which I just think is so much more a part of this than anybody even seems to admit. It's just like the water we swim in now. But I think a lot of what happened is that political communication moved onto a medium that in its fundamental design is designed in opposition to liberal virtues, right? It is not built for deliberation. It is built for compression, that is a compression of ideas then sent through a filter of did your in-group like them? And what is political action when you're trained there? It is shunning. It is the thing you can do to people is not pass a bill against them. It is make them main characters, make them outside the community. I look back and I don't have that many positions I took in that period that I look back on with regret. But the thing I look back on with regret is that I think the people who said we become a liberal were right, and I discounted that. And I think it cost us a lot. Does it justify where the right went? No. Is it part of how the right won power so they could go there? Fucking absolutely. So part of the Abundance Tour, I've been on a bunch of podcasts by the sort of, comedians or other more cultural figures who definitely voted for Obama. And then some of them voted for Trump 1, and then a lot of them voted for Trump 2. I've just been struck because they don't seem a lot of them that happy about what they're getting. But they're not really talking to me about how liberals didn't deliver. And they're not talking to me about how conservatives did deliver. What moved them was that liberals didn't like them. They felt rejected. And I think it's easy to discount that. Oh, you had a sad, so you ushered in fascism. And I said that in a way that makes it a laugh line, but I take it perfectly seriously. The fundamental question in politics is not if you like the politician, it's does the politician like you? That is the heuristic people actually use. Does this political movement like you? Are they going to back you up? And if they are sending every signal that they don't, it's pretty reasonable to not vote for them.
Yeah, I think this is actually the famous Kamala Harris is for they, them, Donald Trump is for you, ad. A lot of people, I was on CNN a couple of times and they bring up this thing over and over again. And the conversation was largely about trans rights are really the core issue that have defined this election, at least in Pennsylvania where it was being run constantly over and over and over again. And, what I think a lot of other people took from that was just it's not even really about that the ad was about trans people. It was about this idea that Democrats or liberals in general are for all of these small groups of people that that doesn't include you. And what's interesting is that even if you add up all of those small groups, those definitely are the majority of the country. Most people don't hear it as them. I would talk to folks who are immigrants themselves, undocumented themselves, and they did not hear Trump as talking about them when he said he was going to go after them and deport them. And there's this impulse now to go well, you got to get what you voted for. Oh, now you're Crimea River, your son-in-law is being deported or whatever. But I'm just I think it's there's a dialectic here, which is that the liberals are also a part of, which led people to believe that they are not talking about you when they say they want to defend who they want to defend. And Derek, what I want to ask you about here is, you were at, you've been in media for, 17 years, right? Is that the right number? 17. Yep. I remembered it. Okay. 17 years, and you have that means that you've lived through multiple waves of progressive backlash and the great awokening, or as we're calling it. And do you, Ezra has kind of pointed out a regret that he has of something, a position that he took, or not taking seriously the idea of liberalism. Is there something that you regret?
From that era, the truth is one of the strange things, frankly, about co-authoring Abundance is that it's thrust me into the role of being not just a politics commentator, but a political communicator. And I feel very strange about that because politics has never been my beat. There's not 1 month in my 17 years at The Atlantic that I was a politics writer. I was a business writer, I was an economics writer, I wrote about entertainment economics, I had a sociology sort of flirtation, I did a podcast called Crazy Genius about science and technology, and then I did whatever it is, aliens. So there was never really a period where my job was to deliver political opinions. And so I don't really have like a deep record there. But one thing that you said about that Kamala ad that I think is really important, because I think this is like, dramatically misunderstood when people analyze why that was the most successful ad, and it gets back to something that Ezra was saying earlier. There is no question that the Kamala, they, them ad was the most successful ad in terms of persuasion. But when you asked voters what their most important issues were, specifically voters that either switched from the Democratic to Republican column or voted for the first time for Donald Trump, the top 4 issues were cost of living, affordability, housing, economy. Inflation was somewhere up there, right? It was all material. And I think what that ad did is take advantage of the fact that while it seems like a cultural argument, like an argument about trans illegal immigrants, what was successful about it was that it employed what voters perceived as the gap between how much Democrats should have been caring about the economy and where their attention was instead. And that gap was very easily exploited, and it was done so in a brutally and darkly efficient way with that advertisement. One thing that Ezra said I think is like really, really important is he's talking about his interest in the history of liberalism. And he's pulling back the thread all the way back to Frederick Douglass. I'm thinking the virtue that you kept sort of touching on is the virtue of tolerance. And tolerance is unbelievably difficult. If you ask me to name the golden age of tolerance in America, what decade would I choose? Like, I mean, obviously, like, it couldn't possibly be before the Civil Rights Act 1965. So is it the 1970s? I don't think anyone living through the 1970s felt like, oh my God, finally, this is the golden age of tolerance. I don't think, was it clearly the this is a very difficult question. Tolerance is it's not that it's not human nature. It's that it's at like the far outer extreme of what human nature is capable of. And it thrives under very specific circumstances. And one circumstance that it does not thrive in is a world in which our attention is absorbed by social media communication. There's an NYU psychologist named Jay Van Bavel, who's run some of my favorite studies of all of psychology. And he looks at basically the ways that our life, our attention, our communication is different online than it is offline. And the most important differences he found is that online, the kind of communication that thrives tends to be negative, high arousal, and most importantly, accentuates in-group versus out-group biases. That is the exact opposite of tolerance, right? So everything that Ezra was saying about how liberalism and the history of liberalism, the legacy of it, calls upon us to activate this far outer extreme capability of human nature, which is tolerance, is exploded when it makes contact with a social media algorithm that wants us to pick enemies and rewards us when we do. And so one thing that I think is really important about your project, about the argument, is recognizing how difficult your project is, like how unusual it is to want a project that is both argumentative and tolerant. It's actually quite difficult to think of like where are like the bastions of both argumentative behavior and tolerant behavior. It's very hard. Like maybe some very successful large Jewish families or something.
But I think
I wonder if we're about to say the same
I think
thing.
the success of toleration projects, though, can be easy to underrate. Like these days, even like the craziest motherfuckers you find do not think we need to use coercive violence to decide exactly which kind of Protestant people need to be. But that was like an incredibly mainstream opinion in 17th century England. Like everybody just took it for granted that like it wasn't good enough to be Christian, it wasn't good enough to be Protestant, you had to be the right kind of Protestant because your soul would be subject to eternal damnation if you weren't, right? I mean, you want to talk about like it's a bigger deal than Prop 8, you know, like endless suffering in hell. And so like, how could you say, well, we're not going to fight about which kind of Protestant should you be? It's the most important thing in the world, right? And like, minds were changed about that, right? And some of it, right? I mean, and there's a whole literature on this, right? There's a pragmatic accommodation, there's a theory, there's arguments about it. Eventually you like stop arguing about this because it's insane. And even, you know, like Donald Trump said at one point that like Muslims should not be allowed to come to the United States at all, which was like the most extreme violation of religious liberty that anybody's ever platformed, which is to say, even he was not saying the Muslims already in the United States should not be allowed to practice their religion, right? Like, we do have a very firm consensus around this kind of thing, and to the point where, like, we don't think about it anymore, and we're like, when did tolerance even exist at all, right? And on some level, it's like it's been with us this whole time, and there are ways to, say that it's not that, okay, this is so important that we like can't live together, but that precisely because it is so important, it cuts so close to our identities, we have to let people have different views about it because it matters that much. It's not like, okay, we all have to agree collectively which side of the road we're going to drive on, because otherwise we'll die, and also it doesn't like actually matter, right? We're just going to pick one. But so many of these other things, they matter so much that, like, you can't just force people to conform.
Sorry to break the fourth wall here, but the time clock isn't working. What time is it?
7:37.
Wow, we're very close to
Having a good time.
We're having a great time. Okay, so,
They
want
can't get out.
They can't leave. The exits are blocked. So I want to ask, like, because the one thing I've been thinking about, because I think, like, everyone on the stage, like, and hopefully everyone in this room, this fight about liberalism, like, I don't think is, like, really won through telling people, like, the history of the religious wars of Europe, and then telling them after that, like, are you afraid that one day you will be part of a persecuted minority? Like,
But have we tried?
Yes, we have. And part of my theory of the argument is that, like, you have to give people answers to the questions that they actually care about, and open the debate about, like, whether it's immigration, about energy, about all these other questions, and actually give them the liberal answer and, like, prove to them that it works. Because to me, like, the thing that I believe is that it's not just that I think it's bad post-liberalism, what Trump is doing, et cetera. It's that, like, it actually doesn't, like, work. Like, he says that he's going to stop the border chaos and get rid of criminals in the streets. And instead we have, like, way more chaos all over American cities, and, like, we're seeing people get arrested, and, like, we're seeing masked agents places, and again, there's still a lot of chaos, and there's still not, every criminal migrant in America being deported, because it's actually quite difficult to find those people. So I wanted to ask, because, to me, the Abundance Project and the project that, like, a lot of people in this room who went to the conference here in DC are working on, sometimes I wonder, like, why the fuck are we even talking about this? Like, what is this doing in this moment when it doesn't really matter to the question of whether or not Donald Trump is going to consolidate power and become a fascist dictator?
I'm doing a lot on that too, but, like, it does matter, because if he's not going to consolidate that power, it's going to be because he lost elections. And if he's going to lose elections, it's going to be because people wanted to vote for the other side in the election. And if they do that, it's going to be because they think that other side is good and not bad. And so I actually have a different theory of the underlying thing than you offered. You sort of said, like, the theory of the argument there is, we're going to really persuade you that the liberal answer is right. We're going to accept there's a debate, but then we're going to win the debate. And sometimes, and I think what you're really saying in a way there is that there's going to be an opening because Donald Trump is going to lose himself the debate by creating chaos in the streets, price increases for everyday Americans on, like, a vast range of goods. And he might. Like, I think there's some reality that thermostatic backlash to bad policies will, like, save the country and possibly save the Democrats. Maybe. I also think that it's true that a lot of these debates can't be won. Like, I don't think there is an answer on immigration that everybody would agree with. People have a different set of values they're weighing off of each other. I've, like, always said this, like, going way back to, like, Vox. Like, we use economics to sanitize the immigration debate. And, like, we endlessly are arguing about, the wage increases or decreases of native-born Americans without a high school education, because, like, that's a comfortable argument to have. But, like, actually, the reason we're having that argument in most cases is not because, like, we could just compensate people if that was a real issue. But no, people have very strong views on who should be here and who shouldn't and how many of them there should be, and overhearing other languages. And, like, you have to accept that some people would take an economic loss to have a country with more people who look like them and fewer people who don't. I think there are two levels to like liberalism winning. And like the way I'd put this is that liberalism became a movement that doesn't deliver. And it became people who didn't like you. And you have to work on both. Abundance is about, for me, the first. Certainly in the places we fucking govern, we have to deliver. Right? My first book, Why We're Polarized, is about why it's very hard to pass big bills through a political system nationally that is designed for localized, highly regionalized parties and requires a lot of bipartisan cooperation to function, right? There's a reason you cannot pass Medicare for all or whatever it might be through a Congress that you often like don't control half of it or any of it, and the filibuster is still operative. Okay. But that doesn't explain why California became unaffordable or why Vermont can't pass single payer. It doesn't explain why New York doesn't have like a subway that goes to the airport. So you at some point have to look at yourself, right, and like create a liberalism that delivers, like a liberalism that has the right goals and delivers them well. Great. But as I was saying about the podcast I've been on, and just like people I know in my life, that's half or less than half the battle. Like people also have to want liberals in charge, thinking that liberals like them, and even if they don't agree with the liberals on immigration, that like it's not going to be disastrous for them in the end. And something you were saying earlier, was that, look, like, you know, shunning people online, it's not like using the power of the state. Somebody said something to me I've been thinking about, not because I'm sure I agree with it, but I think there's like some real truth to it. They were saying that, no, actually, to most people, cultural power is more present than state power. The mass men aren't coming for most people, but most people actually felt the question of what they could and couldn't say, what would and would not be okay in their workplace where they were now getting the DEI trainings. That actually people who had no like role in politics whatsoever felt the changes in what was acceptable, like just acceptable. And maybe nobody's going to come to their house about it or meet them at the airport, but they felt it and it upset them and it made them uncomfortable. I so often heard from people, particularly older people, like, I just don't understand the country anymore. I don't feel like I fit here anymore. Like they 100% voted for Trump after that, right? Once that feeling took hold, like I don't get it. And it wasn't even framed negatively, just like I just feel out of place now. I feel like nobody wants to hear what I have to say. They were gone, they were lost. So there's like one level of liberalism has to deliver, and there's another level of like a virtue that used to be called liberality. Like I just had Sarah McBride, who's a trans member of Congress, but also just a great member of Congress on the show. And she was just amazing in the way she talked about like what it means to like live in community and political community with people who she just knows disagrees with her on things that are very fundamental to her life. And I think that being able to give people the feeling that if we win, we're not coming for them. That like, yes, you want to make their lives better, and yes, like they're not going to agree on everything, but actually one of the mistakes Trump is making is like the feeling that like it's a final battle. You don't want politics to feel like a final battle. You're never on the verge of ultimate victory. And like rebuilding like a mode of political engagement and communication that is less threatening to people is also part of it, because we tried this at Vox. You can't convince everybody you're right, even if you are.
But I do think that like there's an underlying like, I guess, pessimism to a lot of what's being said here. And I want to draw out like how pessimistic you guys really are, because a lot of what the structural issues you're talking about have to do with the way that communication has shifted in this country, right? The reason why these illiberal modes of communication have dominated is that like we're all online. Like even if we're not on Twitter or we're not on TikTok, whatever, it's like short communication that is not conducive to the type of liberality that you're talking about now dominates how we all interact with each other.
That and extremely long, baggy podcasts.
Yes, that's true. Now the argument is saving liberalism with this one podcast. But I mean, this might, but like how? I mean, to me, like if you buy this idea that that on social media that this is the way that communication functions and it's only getting faster and faster, right? Like it's like these are not. I mean, yes, there are these really long podcasts, but I view them mostly as like drive time radio, and while people are also on their phones, like looking at TikTok or Twitter or whatever it is. And I guess like, I mean, very blunt question. So you guys just think we're screwed?
No, I don't know. I'm actually quite optimistic. Like the reason I'm optimistic is because Donald Trump is absolutely terrible, But one thing he's very, very good at that's useful for the left and for liberals and for just the general left of center is that politically and from a policy standpoint, he's actually a very efficient machine for turning the public and public opinion in the opposite direction from the thing that he's just said and embraced. So you look at his immigration policy in Trump 1.0. If you looked at the Pew and Gallup numbers for the share of Americans who thought that immigration was generally good for America, it hit an all-time high during Trump 1.0. I think Biden's immigration policies probably overreacted to what they saw as a signal to essentially say, let's have record high migration through the border. But it was very, very clear that the public was reacting to what Trump was doing, and I think you're beginning to see signs of that again. There was a poll that was done on attitudes toward free trade over the last 6 months, and it decomposed the results by the ideology of the respondents. So it said, how pro-free trade are you if you're very conservative, moderately liberal, very liberal? And the people who are most free trade today, for the first time ever in the time series of the poll, are people who self-identify as very liberal. The folks who were most anti-free trade in the 1990s are now, according to this time series, the most free trade. Why? Because they're responding to Donald Trump's tariff policies. Trump is in many ways like the apex enemy of liberalism. I mean, if liberalism is, I did a conference, a 21st Century Liberalism, where I talked to Steve Pinker about his definition of liberalism, and his sort of like three-part like BLT of what liberalism meant to him was that it's tolerance, it's what Ezra was pulling on, it's a belief in human freedom, which I think also speaks to this idea of acceptance and letting people be what they want to be. And also, he said, for him, what's very important is a sort of like Francis Baconian tradition of scientific curiosity, and how science is an engine, a pacemaker of human progress. And you put all those three things together, I mean, that is precisely what the Trump administration is trying to destroy. They're slashing NIH, they're banning mRNA vaccines, they're attacking everything in the public health infrastructure, from the CDC to everything through the advisory committees on vaccine policy. It's slamming scientific policy in a way that I think is going to be seen as very unpopular. He is immensely intolerant of difference in a way that I think is going to create a kind of backlash against right wokeism, just as there was a backlash against left wokeism. And he is obviously not someone who believes in human freedom. He's someone who believes in a paramilitary force, stalking the country and pulling over people who don't have the right color skin. So it's my hope, my optimistic read here, my gloss, is that if one lesson of modern history is that Donald Trump is very good at winning elections, and very, very bad at staying over 42% approval rating 6 months after winning that election and throughout his presidency, then it's possible that he could negatively polarize a certain share of the electorate toward a position that would allow someone in 2027, 2028 to be a genuinely liberal, Obama-style candidate. I don't think it's out of the question. And one thing that Obama did really beautifully that I think could really well serve our moment is, I said earlier that tolerance sort of exists at the outer realm of sort of human capability. And thinking back on that, I don't know, maybe I'm ambivalent about that as well. But if tolerance is difficult and hard for some people, what's easy and feels wonderful is acceptance. Like, I think people respond in a reciprocal way to folks who say, I am tolerant of differences, and I love the fact that we have some differences, and you're welcome into my community. I think people might respond positively to that in the wake of this sort of left woke and right woke eras. And I see like a decently wide lane for someone to run, I don't know who it's going to be, for someone to run on what are essentially classically liberal principles in a way that might not have had the same purchase 10 years ago, when you didn't have a president that was this intolerant, and you didn't have a president that was this violative of personal liberties, and you didn't have a president that was this anti-science. But if you put all that together and you put the negative polarization we're starting to see, maybe it is an opportunity for someone to really be a truly liberal candidate.
And the addendum I would make to that in defense of slightly wonky, yakking, long articles, et cetera, is that like governing is in fact harder than coming up with messaging, right? And part of what we saw in the Trump to Biden back to Trump immigration swing is that the Biden people absolutely caught in opposition like a good vibe on immigration. What they didn't have was like a good plan to deliver on that vibe in a way that was going to be sustainable. And I think a lot now about where we're going with energy, right? So like Trump won, electricity prices are going up. You ask anyone, you scratch any climate group, whatever, in the world, they're like, we're all about affordability now. And I'm like, well, are you? And it's like, well, sure, because Trump is killing wind, Trump is killing solar, that's bad for affordability. We're all about affordability. And like, great, I'm glad. Do we have an agenda to make energy more affordable? Like, if you win the election, right? Like, A, is that what you actually believe? Or is this just like an affordability skin suit on like what the Sierra Club's always wanted? And B, it's just also like, do your plans work? Like utility regulation. My uncle is a utility regulation economist. He likes to send me sometimes like long ass emails about
Everyone has
all the
one of those.
details I've gotten wrong about this. It's like mind-numbingly boring. You're not gonna like win an election with like a really awesome take on how to tweak utility regulation. But if you govern the country on the basis of a promise to make people's electricity bills lower, like
But wasn't
you got to
the
come up
Biden
with something
theory?
that works.
Wasn't the Biden theory deliverism that like if you just delivered certain things, and so you're
Yeah, they should have
Well,
tried it.
they said. I mean, deliverism is a slogan that was associated with some of the people in the Biden administration, but like. Doing a good jobism is, I think, like a smaller view than that, right? And it's just like you have to have ideas that work, right? Like if you deliver like a very chaotic border situation and like crime is higher and also there's all this inflation, so you're like, I got you student loan relief for 2 years a year and a half ago, like, that's not that compelling, right?
If inflation had been 4.2% at its peak and Biden was 71, he would have won re-election.
Yes,
we would have been
exactly.
having this conversation.
But even that's like
5.7.
right. I mean, it could have been higher. That's what I mean.
6,
Like just doing a little bit better at the
Yeah.
margin on the
Would
substance
have really
of
mattered.
governing would have made a huge difference.
Nobody's got a plan right now in this country for 62% political majorities. It's a game of inches. And like, you can win some inches in political demeanor, win some inches with good policies, win some inches on communication, win some inches on delivery, win some inches with good luck rather than bad luck. And like the thing about the parties being as they are is that whether you end up like right over here or right over here, it's hugely different worlds. Just huge.
Yep.
And so you gotta like maximize everything. I mean, this is a point Matt's always making, but if you believe the stakes are high, then you have to play like they're really high. And I think like one of the really great critiques, like one of my critiques from a different perspective sometimes than Matt's was like, if you think this guy is fascism and you know that 80% of the country thinks your candidate is too old to run again, you can tell me one or the other, but you can't keep telling me both. That like, this is the Ragnarok of American politics, and don't worry about our guy who can't give a long interview. Like, you can't do that. And so like the Democrats are just gonna have to get like, and I think have gotten in many cases, but like really just serious about playing to win, and that means doing things that don't always feel good, right? Not always the move you want to make, but is a move that you have to make. Like I just like, in a lot of ways, I want to see like a party full of like much more killer political strategists who are willing to say things people don't like. But I do just like want to, at the end, I don't know how close we are to the end, but like push back on one piece of pessimism. We're long past peak Twitter. We are just long past it. Like whether you should be on Twitter or not should be, like one reason.
even like TikTok, even Reels.
TikTok's very different. I don't really think we understand what works on TikTok. Am I sure J.D. Vance is a candidate lab created for TikTok? I am not. Like, I am not certain he is a candidate lab created for TikTok. I don't even think we really know what TikTok is politically yet. Like, we're still early in that. Vertical video is not a compression mechanism in the same way. Like, you get a lot of long vertical videos. So I just don't know. We're moving into new things. The best candidate we have seen at TikTok is Zoran Mamdani. And I don't think it's an accident that he's an incredibly friendly form of politics, right? A big smile, like endlessly going around like New York dapping people up, like just like he's also got importantly mimetic policies, right? Like I don't think you can disconnect him from like an argument about affordability, like policies that in a single line stand in for like his whole agenda and whole outlook on life, and then a human being like built and like with incredible visual taste. Like that wouldn't work if it wasn't coming from the candidate who is himself like raised in a household that understands the visual film medium like as well as anybody alive. But I don't think it's obvious. Like Trump was native to Twitter. Like he was Twitter in human form. And like look where we are. But that's not the next but it's going to be very important. That means to me that it would be good if Democrats were led by people who understood this stuff and consumed it themselves. Like you just one of my projects is just to try to use my show. You have to take the communication medium seriously, not just communication, not just how loudly you want to say the thing you want people to hear, but you actually have to understand the medium itself and have people who are native to it who are at the top of your party. And I don't think Democrats exactly do, though they're starting to have some, but Republicans definitely don't. So I think it's a pretty real jump ball.
Well, this is the first time I've heard a positive take on short-form video content, so I think it's a good time to go to our last and final question, which is, what is an argument you've come across recently that you absolutely detested? Matt.
Okay, so there was a piece just really recently by Eugenia Chang, New York Times op-ed, and it's this. It's a defense of DEI, and it does this thing that I think a lot of liberal commentary on cultural issues does, which is her project is she knows that DEI is under attack, and she knows that a lot of left of center people feel bad about that, and they want to feel good about it, and so she has this total evasion of what is this conversation even about? And she just says well, giving some extra help to people who are suffering from discrimination, what's wrong with that? And indeed, what is wrong with that, right? And it's maybe she should have asked someone who has a problem with it, what their critique is, right? And to me, it's it's very frustrating that at this late day, when we know there has been a lot of backlash, when we know that a lot of questions have been raised about leftist identity politics, to see the main outlets of the sort of left of center establishment doing this kind of cocooning of everybody's feelings. And it's all fine. There's not even a real disagreement here about anything. And I think it's it's anti-clarifying. I would have rather had someone who ran a DEI program and really thought it was good, explain why the actual things that they're actually doing are good and important, or see someone say something that I agree with, that they're bad, but this kind of futzing around, oh, can't we just all be nice? Yeah, let's be nice. But that's not actually what the push around DEI is about. And I think it's important to join these arguments sharply and not just kind of muff them.
Derek.
I have two. I'll do them both very quickly, hopefully. One is there was a review of Abundance that was published today in the New York Review of Books.
Oh, great.
And I have two issues with it, by Trevor Jackson. I have two issues with it. Number one, there was an illustration that attended the article.
Your hair.
That
magnificent.
represented my forehead as if it's sometimes people say you have a 4 head, no, you have a 5 head. It represented me as an 11,100 head. It just went all the way up to the sky. I looked like a, don't even look. Yeah, don't even tell the camera. I looked like, they're all laughing. I looked like a baby with a toupee. And that really stung. But
visual art is an argument. So that was a good one.
Yeah, exactly. But the underlying argument of the piece was.
I thought I looked okay, actually.
I thought you looked fine. You looked fine. Whatever. The underlying argument of the piece was essentially that while Abundance sort of played lightly around the edges of the American capitalist system by calling for sort of targeted deregulation to make it easier to build solar and wind, what we really need in this country and in this world is the total dismantling of capitalism and class. And my general feeling about the argument that what we need in order to solve very, very specific practical problems is to change everything about the way that the world works. The fact that there's still places, really prestigious places, that have time for this argument, that beautiful language, that essentially just hand waves the changing of the entire political economic structure of the entire world, because climate change is global, I don't have a lot of patience for that. And I truly would, what I would have patience for, what I would like to see on the subject of tolerance, is if someone had like a really articulate 13 or 113 part agenda for exactly how we dismantle capitalism, I would read that, but often it's just like enormously hand-wavy.
It's 113 Walmart.
In the interest of this being climate change, this being like quite an urgent problem that we have to solve without losing election after election after election, I just wish that there was a slightly more that it was more high status to make pragmatic arguments about fixing climate change in places like the New York Review of Books. The second thing that I would say is on a more personal level. I have one child, 2 years old. My wife is pregnant, second due in early December. And,
Woo! There's Laura.
And one of the first pieces of advice that we got quite consistently from older folks was, when you have a baby, you have to, you know that the child has to come first. The child must come first. And I got this really fun piece of counter wisdom from a friend, Brian Levinson, who essentially said, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard in the world. The child cannot come first. He said, you have to come first. You have to prioritize yourself, because if you don't prioritize yourself, you'll never be a good partner. And second comes your partner. And if you don't have a good partnership, you'll never be good parents. And then third, if you have time, comes the child. And I did love this idea that there is a way to be generously selfish as a parent and to put yourself first, even during a period of life where you are told that you can't put yourself first and it's supposed to be miserable, and there's all of these essays, some in the New York Times or the Atlantic or all sorts of prestigious media about the terrors of parenthood. I think it would be nice, not just for individuals, but maybe even for the national fertility rate, if we told people that it was culturally acceptable to be a selfish parent.
Derek and Laura are great parents, so no one calls CPS.
I'm just going to say on that, before I say the thing I actually disagree with, that I had this moment yesterday, because I do weirdly get asked for parenting advice a lot when we do AMAs, and I always actually give a version of what your friend said to you, which is you got to parent yourself first. And I was thinking, it's not actually that helpful advice, because people can't take advice, and it's hard to parent yourself first. And then I had this great moment where I was like, what I really wish before I'd become a parent was that somebody had taught me to brace my core when I lift things. Because I actually fucked up my back with both of my kids for a bit, and then worked with a trainer for a while, and got much better at bracing when I lifted anything, and now do it when I open a window. But you're getting old, and you can really pull things. And
this would be like a French crash service, but for helping dads brace their back.
You can learn how to brace when you lift even fairly small weights, and for parents, your ergonomic. So anyway, I think it would be helpful. J.D. Vance gave a speech at the Claremont Institute now probably a couple months ago about the Eric Schmidt speech. It's just bootleg J.D. Vance, and it's about who belongs here. And it's a very, very, I'm trying to think of the right way to characterize it. It is about why a lot of you don't belong here. And it is about why the people who fought in the Civil War, including on the wrong side, how anybody who's got that blood in their family, they obviously belong in a way that the people who believe in the Declaration of Independence, whatever their current, ancestors or descendants believe, don't, right? It's a frontal argument against creedal nationalism. And I do think J.D. Vance is profoundly wrong in his belief that in his campaign to diminish what it means to believe in the ideals of this country, his campaign to make the Declaration of Independence much closer to irrelevant in what it means to be an American than it currently is or has been. But that's not even the part of this that I'm pointing out here. Vance he goes forward in this argument in a part that people have not touched on that much. So be what are we doing all this for? Why are we arguing about who belongs? What's the point of having citizens? And in a way, I think he tries to take the other side of the argument from abundance. It's the whole point is to build America, to build a great country, to build bridges, to build roads, to build industry. And that's a wonderful, I thought, vulnerability for him to open up for us, because what has built this country is our ability to bring people in. to bring in their muscle, to bring in their toil, to bring in their genius, to bring in all kinds of people who were so excited to be here because they believed in what this country meant, that they would then devote their lives to its betterment. They would fight in its wars. They would invent things here. And when we were on the Abundance Tour, I remember we were on the 11th hour one night. And I had this, got asked this question, and I was very tired. And and what came out is something I've thought about a lot since, which is their vision sucks. And the country it would build is bad. And the great weak spot they've opened up, maybe to be more on your side of can we convince people that liberal ideas are right, is that America became great. It became a world-spanning colossus, and we should defend more of what that was than we do. But it became great and became this absolute juggernaut of innovation and might, because in a way that many other countries couldn't, we could bring people in and make them part of
I
this
have a
place.
pitch for a book that sort of links abundance themes on economics with national identity and immigration, but it, I don't know if it would sell as well.
The problem I fear for you is you have to be willing to make immigration more salient.
Well, Matt, Derek, Ezra, thank you so much.
The Arguments production team includes Ranjini Chakraborty, Isabella Pereira, Angela Tracy, Kate Crawford, and Eli Richmond. Our theme music is by Breakmaster Cylinder. If you want to hear more from The Argument, you can become a subscriber at theargumentmag.com.